Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Elizabeth Rosner. I'll tell you all about her in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership perspective and you work with leaders, as we will discover that Elizabeth does, you do it to bring people together for common cause. Elizabeth Rosner, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here with you.
I want to tell folks all about you. You are an author and teacher whose work focuses on the redemptive power of storytelling and deep listening. You've written 6 books and received much acclaim. Your newest book is The Third Ear, which I find totally fascinating. And it reflects on stories of your growing up in a multilingual household with multidisciplinary research. And it's incredibly well researched, but so well and eloquently told. You have been a finalist for National Jewish Book Awards and for other things. And so it is, and you're a teacher now focusing on more on writing, I think, at this life stage. So Elizabeth, welcome.
Thanks so much. Yeah, my writing and my teaching have always been very much intertwined. I've been teaching for a long, long time, but I've also been writing for a very long time.
The opening of your book, The Third Ear, captured me at the get-go. You say, hearing is a science, listening is an art. Explain that, please.
Well, I think when you think about all your other senses, we know that there's more to it than just looking at something. There's a difference between looking at something and observing something, or tasting something and then trying to really figure out the ingredients of what you've just tasted. So I think hearing is similar in that there's more going on than just frequency and vibration entering our ears. And listening as an art means there's interpretation going on. There's filtering, discernment, there's questioning, there's all the creative practices you do when you hear sound of a certain kind, or memory associated with sound. So when I titled this book Third Ear, it was a way of saying, expand your mind, think beyond just the limitations of what these two things can do. What is a full body experience of taking in a sound, or a silence for that matter?
Well, The Third Ear, and I have read the book and studied it, and I'm still struggling exactly what the third ear is. So could you help my small brain wrap around that concept, please?
Sure. I think, does that mean I have failed somehow in the book?
No, you haven't. No. It's because you stated right there. The subtitle is Reflections on the Art and Science of Listening. So I think perhaps that's what it is. No, you haven't failed. It's just I have a small brain.
No, I'm teasing you. I think, when I first came across the phrase, it was a shocker to me too, and it made me really curious. It was the title of a book by Theodore Reich, who was in some ways the person who, you could say, founded psychotherapy. After Freudian analysis, he went into something that he said was more interactive between therapist and client or patient. And he wrote a book called Listening with the Third Ear. And that just made me want to do a deep dive into what does that mean? And many of us have heard of a third eye, and we know it's not an actual organ, right? We know we don't have a third eye somewhere. So it's a metaphor, really. And in the sense of third ear, similarly, it's what else is going on when we're impacted by sounds and silences. I, for example, believe that I am also listening with my skin, or with my heart, or even with my belly. When you think about interactions you've had with people, and you felt the hair stand up on the back of your neck, or your skin prickle, or you feel a kind of warmth flooding you. Those are all ways in which I think our third ear has been activated. And I also, as you'll probably go into, I'm doing more than just talking about how human beings listen to each other. I'm also really interested in the way we engage with the natural world, and the way animals listen to each other, to us, and what else we can learn about that.
Well, to jump ahead, then I think that it's to use the word immersive listening. You go into I don't know if I can use the study of trees and the
Mhm,
interaction with
mhm,
them, and and the way that trees communicate with one another.
mhm,
And that's not something we humans hear, but perhaps trees do. So.
mhm. Yeah, again, I think when you start to allow the concept of listening to broaden outside of the most limited kind of mechanistic expression of our sense into signals being sent back and forth, communication, as you put it. We don't necessarily know if it's language when whales are singing to each other in the ocean. But once we began detecting those songs and recognizing that there were real patterns, there were real signals that were forms of communication, I'm not that interested in the debate about whether it's called language. I'm just fascinated by all these messages being sent back and forth. So with trees, one of the most important teachers at the moment, a woman, a botanist named Suzanne Simard, Dr. Suzanne Simard, at first, when she was talking about these trees communicating with each other, she was mocked by her colleagues, and she was told she was anthropomorphizing trees, and they weren't humans, therefore we shouldn't talk about them as a mother tree. And yet, once she was able to measure the chemicals, to measure what these trees were sending down through their root system into their nearby saplings or offspring, it made sense to call it a mother tree. And she began to really persuade people that that imagery was accurate and that what that was it was not just nutrients and nourishment, but it was also beneficial protection against insects or illness. And now that we've adapted chemotherapies from such trees, their methods of self-protection we are using for our own bodies as well. So that's another form of communication. They're sharing with us their knowledge.
No, that really fleshes out the holistic
Mhm,
concept of listening and hearing and a say. Now, you weave your personal story into this book, and
mhm,
a part of it is, of course, your parents, who are both Holocaust survivors.
mhm.
And if I got it correctly, you grew up exposed to six different languages. So, how did that cacophony of sounds and language impact your ability to listen, or did you, as a kid, just turn off? So,
And that's a great way of putting it because I think I did a little bit of both. I think, one of the things I write about early in the book is the idea that we are already listening in utero. And being in the womb of a mother who was herself a polyglot. My mother actually spoke 7 languages, only 3 of which she shared with my father. But I imagine myself, floating in this what I call symphonic mother tongue, that somewhere in me I was being exposed to all these different melodies and words and vocabularies. And so I think from a very early age, I was really trying to tune into all these different sounds and eventually realizing that English was somehow going to be our shared language in the family, but that my mother had these other ways of speaking with other people in her life. She had Polish friends and Russian friends that she spoke with in those languages, and the rest of us didn't know a word. And so there was a way that I was really starting to understand that there was more to it than just English, even though I grew up in the United States. And then there was German, which was my father's native language, and my mother actually also spoke German, but they didn't want us to speak it because for them as Holocaust survivors, German, the language itself, was what they called the language of the murderers. And it carried a really dark and painful association. So each language I began to understand had not just a set of sounds, but also a set of feelings that went with it. Yeah.
and picking up on that feelings,
Mhm.
that is fleshes out, I'm in my sense, a sense of through line for you in both the hearing and the science of listening, the hearing and the listening, and processing it.
Mhm.
Because I mean, as a child growing up in it, it wasn't clear, scientifically clear to you, but it shaped you. Do you have a
Mhm.
perspective on that? So,
Yeah, again, I think that's really well put. At first, the sounds of our family are just what we think of as normal, right? They're
mhm.
just, that's how my parents sound. That's parent sound. And yet, when I was about age 6, one of my childhood friends came over to the house and heard my parents talking and said to me afterwards, "Oh, your parents talk funny. They have accents."
Yeah.
And it was really a very strong kind of before after moment in my life, that I went from not thinking about the sound of my parents to really thinking a lot about the sound of my parents being different to me than to somebody else, and what that meant to somebody else. And therefore, it was going to change what it meant to me. And I think from then on, I really started tuning into the world in that kind of curious and more interpretive way. And oh, some of my parents' voices sound more like that, or some of my friends' parents sound American? Is that the sound of American without an accent? And what does it mean to have an accent? What are accents? And then I was also, as I write in the book too, a kind of a lonely kid. And so even though I had siblings, we were all kind of going our separate ways. And I think I was looking for connection through sound. And some of that was human language, and some of that was the sound of my dog, or the sound of the wind, or underwater sounds. And so it was all a part of my discovery of how I belonged in the world, not just the human world, but the wide world.
Now, speaking of your childhood, because it echoes mine in a bit in one aspect, because you speak about Leonard Bernstein's The Young People's Concert, which
Yeah.
is, of course, music and that language. So, what was the connection? How did those concerts or music radiate with you or resonate with
Mhm.
you, Elizabeth? So,
Well, my parents, they were great fans of classical music. We had a stereo. I grew up with one of those big boxy stereos that took up, seemed like, half the living room. And, they didn't have a huge collection of record albums, but they had a number of albums that were played over and over and that I loved. And opera, I didn't understand at all. Opera didn't work for me, but both Peter and the Wolf and the New World Symphony were albums I played over and over again. And Peter and the Wolf, especially this Prokofiev symphony that was using instruments as if they were animal voices telling a story. And I was just smitten. And so I think, even though I didn't think of it as my musical education, I think it was the beginning of that. And later in life, my father's life, when I was with him as he was ill and nearly dying, I spent a lot of time with him during the first part of the COVID lockdown. One of the ways we connected best was watching videos of Leonard Bernstein conducting some of his favorite pieces. And it was a deeply, moving way to share our love of music, my father and I.
that is good. And music connects with us in a way that the words do not.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
and you had talked about earlier about a sound will cause us, it provokes a reaction. It could be an emotional reaction,
mhm,
tears. It could be prickly skin or goosebumps or whatever it is. And music does that, and it connects us in very different ways. And so
mhm,
that's
mhm.
part of our listening more than with our ears, but maybe with our spirit, shall we say, our
Mhm.
soul, if we will. So great.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, is that we don't always understand why a certain piece of music makes us feel the way we do, and sometimes we don't even wanna analyze it, we just wanna savor that feeling, but often it's an association we have with some event or experience or relationship, and so, yeah, our hearts are very much involved in that listening process.
Now, what gives your book depth? And in addition to your eloquent writing, you are a poet, and as you had said earlier, when we got in the stage that you um, um, eh, go back and forth between the two media, but you're not sure which comes out. But I can tell you're a poet because you write so eloquently, and um, I encourage people to read your book because it's just a joy just to read. But you spice it up or give it some heft, as we say, with a lot of scientific analysis. You mentioned the trees, but also psychotherapy and other things. So, what
Mhm.
led you to want to add that, Elizabeth? So,
Well, in my previous book, Survivor Cafe, which is a book about the intergenerational inheritance of trauma and resilience, I'm a daughter of Holocaust survivors, as you mentioned earlier. And in that book that was the first time I really began to employ this woven strategy of my own experience growing up in a survivor family, a household with two parents who were Holocaust survivors. But I was also really interested in understanding more about the theory of epigenetic inheritance, which is something that a lot of people now understand about the ways that the expression of our DNA is modified by trauma. And I also was interested in memory and the way we sometimes feel as if we carry the memories of people that lived even before we were born. So, already from my previous book, I had developed this strategy or approach, you could say, that wove together my own experience personally with my investigation into a lot of different fields of study. So, when it came to this book, again, I was really curious about what do we understand, for example, about equine therapy with children on the autism spectrum? What do we know about those relationships between children and horses that not just touches me personally, but really impacts a lot of people across cultures and across time? So every time I had a question or something that I wanted to know more about because of my own interest, I just allowed myself to track that research until I learned what I needed to learn. I wasn't trying to become an expert in acoustic biology, but I was trying to connect the dots. I was trying to create a kind of web of information for people to see how things are connected.
right. Now, a key theme for many of our listeners, because who are in the coaching and the field of human development and many other things, is storytelling. And
Mhm.
you tell your own story, but weave the story of others into the book. And so, what is the relevance of hearing or listening on storytelling? What is your perspective from your research or experience that tells you this, informs this, Elizabeth?
Another great question. Thank you. Yeah, I think in the realm of leadership and what can be learned about listening and the power of listening, I know there are a lot of books out there that are more sort of methodological or self-help or strategies you can employ to be a better listener as a boss or as a colleague or as a team builder. And I'm fascinated by all of that too, but I really wanted to make sure that my work was more about the narrative practices we have, and how do you know that someone is listening to you? They're not just maybe nodding or making eye contact, but they're really waiting until you've completely expressed yourself. There is this tendency we have sometimes to want to jump in quickly to let the person know not only that I've heard you, but I have something I want to add to what you're saying. And yet for a lot of us, and this is true across many cultures, we feel interrupted or we might feel cut off, that you were paying attention only to the point where you wanted to start talking yourself rather than pay attention in a way that allows me to really feel I've been taken in all the way, and that now you're going to wait before you respond because you were so fully attentive to me that you weren't just planning what you were going to say in response. And I think we know the difference. We know when that's happening.
Absolutely. And when you say planning what I will to say next, that of course does not apply to anybody I know, not personally, of course, but no, because and part of it is the acceleration of our lives. We're busy doing things, and so tell me your story, Elizabeth. And I'm watching my clock and checking my iPhone at the same time, and so we get pushed and pulled. So. Do you have any advice on how we can stop doing that?
It's tough, and I think we really have to ask ourselves, what matters most. Is it how much you can accomplish in the course of a conversation, or is it really that the person feels that sense of your full attention? So yeah, maybe you didn't, maybe our interview isn't going to cover all the topics you had prepared in your notes, but we are really connecting. We are really meeting on some level that does matter. It's not quantitative, it's qualitative, right? So I've found that with my own sense of time in the world, that when I'm rushing, when I'm stressed about not being able to get enough done, lo and behold, time shrinks. There's less of it. Whereas when I slow my own racing agenda down and I just allow myself to include stillness, to include being more patient, time expands. And that might sound like, oh, she's been living in California for too long, but really, I feel that. It's my experience, right? And so if you trust that a conversation isn't a race to see who's going to say more or who's going to get to the finish line of their notes, but really, have we connected? Have we said meaningful things to each other?
Elizabeth Rosner, one of the things that gives your book depth is your candor, your personal story, relationships, but also you're very courageous, I would say, and candid. You have experienced a hearing loss.
Mhm,
So, how did a loss of hearing to a degree affect your ability to listen? So,
mhm. Yeah, so it's toward the end of the book, and strangely, while I was writing this book about listening and doing all of this research and paying even more attention to my own listening practices and how they succeeded and sometimes failed and what I could do better and what I could learn, lo and behold, I woke up one morning and noticed that something was really plugging up my right ear. And at first, because I had a history of ear infections as a kid and I'm a swimmer, I thought, oh, I just have, some wax buildup or something. And eventually I found out through doctor visits and some tests and eventually even a brain scan that in fact I have a benign tumor in my right auditory canal and in my inner ear. It's something called an acoustic neuroma. It's also sometimes called a vestibular schwannoma. And that was a wake up call of a kind, even though we weren't necessarily going to do anything about it right away. We were going to watch it. I say we, my doctors and I. Um, it was such a strange reminder that hearing is something very fragile. Our listening abilities can be impacted by something sudden or prolonged, and that it started to make me think about how much more sensitive my hearing was going to be now that I was aware of this diminishment on one side. So you mentioned that this is a vulnerable part of my story, but it's true that we sometimes have a lot of stigma associated with hearing loss and aging, and that gets into a whole thing about our, the decay of our bodies or other physical limitations we have, but it actually increased my sensitivity and awareness and even empathy, which is a lot of what this book is about, tuning into our listening practices as a way of building empathy.
isn't it interesting how diminishment, and you use that word, I loved it when you talk about hearing, makes us appreciate it even more. Although you were in the study of
Mhm,
listening and hearing and understanding, but sometimes when you take it away, you go, "Oh, I really missed that." And we all experience that as we get older. We're less capable physically of doing
mhm,
some things,
mhm,
of course. But and that's and it's that sense of loss. But I think dealing with it as you have done and done in the book gives the rest of us hope, Elizabeth.
Well, I hope the book does inspire all kinds of things, including just curiosity, but empathy for sure. I know that I am much more sensitive to noisy spaces, public spaces. I really have to position myself, to the right of somebody so that my good ear is turned toward them. And I really have to think about where am I going to be in this restaurant that isn't going to be super echoey or make conversation at the table impossible. And again, it helps me understand that we have individual sensitivities and cultural sensitivities, but how do we help each other? How do so I tell my friends now, can you be on this side of me when we're walking? Can you, sit on this side of the table?
No, that's true, and thank you for sharing that. And I'm well aware of that. Of course, I'm not losing my hearing at all. It's sharp as ever. All you have to do is ask my wife. Uh, and so,
Yeah.
but and that makes us more vulnerable, and essentially
Mhm,
makes us more human. So,
mhm,
which segues into my next question. As you know, I ask every guest a story about grace. Do
mhm.
you have a story to share with us, Elizabeth? So.
I do, and it's really in some ways, a kind of a spoiler alert because it's a story that comes from the last part of the book, and it has to do with my being with my father as he was dying. I live on the farthest coast away from where my father lived and where I grew up. So I'm in California in Berkeley, and my father was in Schenectady, New York, where I grew up and where he stayed. And um, every time I left him, I would be afraid that I'd never see him again. My mother had actually died while I was on a plane flying to see her in the hospital. And so with my father, he used to say, I promise I'll wait for you. And it was one of the most intimate exchanges we had where I told him that I was afraid about being too far away when he was leaving. And he did, he waited for me. So I flew back in time to be with him in the last few days of his life, and our communication, which had gone over the years from a lot of shouting at each other and a lot of arguing to a lot of really beautiful unspoken communication, very, very quiet to the point where there were no words at all. And the grace I experienced being with him as he was dying was in that way, where he was just holding my hand and I was holding his, and he just squeezed my hand. And it was later that I realized that he was saying, I love you, just by squeezing my hand. That was grace.
What a powerful story. I love that. And in that, there's a note that I think is important to the study of hearing or listening. And it's no words need be spoken, but we're still
Mhm,
listening, or certainly with your father's example,
mhm,
but
mhm,
touch does it. But also, I think we can observation too.
mhm.
Do you have a perspective on that, Elizabeth? So
Well, I think that's the answer to your question earlier, John. What is third ear listening? It's that. It's recognizing that it isn't only what we're taking in this way that helps us understand a form of communication. So my father squeezing my hand 3 times, or we've all experienced nonverbal glances across a room even, um, or a way that when we lean against a tree something happens. We feel that we are with a living being, another being. I certainly had it with my dog, my beloved dog Lulu, that shared my life for 10 years. I learned what her whimpers meant. I learned what a certain bark meant that was different from another kind of bark. And it wasn't just that I was teaching her my commands. I was learning to listen to her vocabulary and what it meant. So these are relational communications, and they're not just sound. They can be wordless, as you say.
that's great. Elizabeth, how can people find you and your great book, The Third Ear?
Thank you. Well, I have a website, elizabethrosner.com, with all the information all about my 6 books, including the one previous to this one that I talked about earlier, Survivor Cafe, 3 novels, a poetry collection, third year, Survivor Cafe. I teach online and in person. I travel a lot. I love hearing from people. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Facebook. There are a lot of places you can find me, but you can start with my website. It's all there.
Right. Elizabeth Rosner, it has been a joy to have you on the show today. And with that, we will go out.
Thanks so much, John.